Captain Elena Petrov adjusted her flight helmet and walked across the muddy airfield toward her aircraft. The morning mist clung to the ground like smoke from yesterday's bombing raids. Around her, male pilots gathered in small groups, their conversations stopping as she passed. She had grown used to the silence that followed her wherever she went on the base. At 24, Elena had logged more flight hours than most of the men half her age, but that never seemed to matter. To them, she would always be just the woman who flew supplies and wounded soldiers back and forth across the Eastern Front. Nothing more than a glorified taxi driver with wings. The year was 1943, and the war had been raging for over 2 years. Elena had been flying transport missions for 18 months, ferrying everything from ammunition to medical supplies to the front lines. She had made over 200 flights, many of them under enemy fire, but still the other pilots treated her like she was playing dress-up in a real pilot's uniform. Her aircraft, a modified Douglas C-47 transport plane, sat on the tarmac like a tired workhorse. The mechanics had finished their pre-flight checks hours ago, and the cargo was already loaded. Today's mission was supposed to be routine. Deliver medical supplies to a forward field hospital, pick up wounded soldiers, and fly them back to the main medical facility 200 kilometers behind the lines. Elena climbed into the cockpit and began her own pre-flight routine. She had learned never to trust anyone else completely when it came to her aircraft. Every switch, every gauge, every control surface had to be checked personally. Her life depended on this machine, and she treated it with the respect it deserved. As she worked through her checklist, her co-pilot, Lieutenant Viktor Kozlov, climbed into the seat beside her. Viktor was one of the few men on the base who treated her with genuine respect. He had flown with her for 6 months and had seen firsthand how she handled the aircraft in difficult situations. "Weather report came in," Viktor said, settling into his seat. "Clear skies most of the way, but there are storm clouds building to the northwest. Should be fine for our route, though." Elena nodded and continued her checks. The engines turned over smoothly and all systems showed green. She had requested this particular aircraft because she knew every rivet, every wire, every quirk in its behavior. The mechanics called her obsessive, but Elena preferred to think of herself as thorough. Major Volkov, the squadron commander, approached the aircraft just as Elena was completing her engine run-up. Through the open cockpit window, she could hear him talking to the ground crew chief. "Make sure she sticks to the assigned route," Volkov was saying. "These transport runs aren't combat missions. Her job is to deliver supplies and get back safely. Nothing more." The words stung, but Elena had heard worse. Major Volkov had made his opinion of female pilots clear from the day she arrived at the base. He tolerated her presence because higher command had ordered it, but he never missed an opportunity to remind her that she was not considered a real military pilot. Elena had earned her pilot's license before the war, flying crop dusters and mail planes for a small aviation company. When the war started, she had volunteered immediately, but the military had initially refused to accept female pilots for combat roles. It had taken direct intervention from high command to create the Women's Transport Squadron, and even then, they were restricted to non-combat missions. The irony was not lost on Elena. She had more experience with difficult flying conditions than most of the fighter pilots on the base. She had landed aircraft in farmers' fields during thunderstorms, navigated by dead reckoning through mountain passes in zero visibility, and once successfully performed an emergency landing after losing an engine over hostile territory. But because she flew transports instead of fighters, her skills were dismissed as unimportant. As Elena taxied to the runway, she passed a group of fighter pilots preparing for their morning patrol. Through her side window, she could see them watching her with expressions that ranged from amusement to barely concealed contempt. One of them, Captain Boris Petenko, made an exaggerated saluting gesture as she passed. The others laughed. Petenko was the worst of them. He never missed an opportunity to make jokes about pretty girls playing with airplanes. He had shot down 3 enemy aircraft in the past month and never let anyone forget it. Every conversation eventually turned to his combat exploits, usually delivered with pointed looks in Elena's direction. "Tower to Transport 7, came the radio call as Elena reached the runway threshold. "You are cleared for takeoff. Wind is light and variable. Have a safe flight." Elena pushed the throttles forward and felt the familiar surge of power as the twin engines roared to life. The C-47 rolled down the runway, gradually picking up speed until the ground fell away beneath them. This was the moment Elena loved most about flying. The transition from earthbound machine to something that could soar through the sky like a bird. As they climbed to cruising altitude, Elena reflected on the conversation she had overheard the previous evening. A group of pilots had been discussing the latest intelligence reports about increased enemy fighter activity along the transport routes. One of them had suggested that perhaps the women pilots should be assigned to safer routes, farther from the front lines. "It's not that we don't think they can fly," Captain Potenko had said with mock sincerity. "But transport pilots aren't trained for air-to-air combat. If they run into enemy fighters, they're sitting ducks. Better to keep them safely away from any real danger." The other pilots had nodded in agreement, as if the matter was settled. Elena had wanted to speak up, to remind them that she had actually encountered enemy fighters twice in the past month and had successfully evaded them both times. But she knew that any protest would only be seen as evidence that women were too emotional for military service. The truth was that Elena had been studying aerial combat tactics in her spare time. She had read every manual she could find, interviewed fighter pilots about their experiences, and even convinced a few of the more friendly ones to describe their combat maneuvers in detail. She understood the theory of air-to-air combat as well as any pilot on the base, but theory was not the same as experience. What the male pilots didn't know was that Elena had been secretly practicing combat maneuvers during her transport flights. When she was alone in empty airspace, she would put the C-47 through simulated dogfight sequences, testing the aircraft's limits and her own reflexes. The transport plane was not designed for aerobatic flight, but it was more maneuverable than most people realized, especially when flown by someone who understood its capabilities. As they flew eastward toward the front lines, Elena scanned the sky constantly. Enemy fighters had been becoming more aggressive lately, and transport aircraft were attractive targets. A single fighter could easily shoot down a lumbering C-47, and the loss of medical supplies or wounded soldiers could have serious consequences for ground operations. Victor was monitoring the radio, listening for any reports of enemy aircraft in the area. So far, everything was quiet, but that could change quickly. The front lines had been shifting back and forth for weeks, and it was sometimes difficult to know exactly where friendly and enemy forces were positioned. "Contact ahead," Victor called out, pointing toward a formation of aircraft in the distance. "Looks like 4 fighters, heading northwest. Can't tell if they're ours or theirs yet." Elena squinted at the distant specks, trying to make out their silhouettes. Aircraft identification was crucial in wartime, and making a mistake could be fatal. After a few seconds, the aircraft turned slightly, and she could see their distinctive wing shapes clearly. "Those are ours," she said with relief. "Yak 9s from the look of them. Probably the morning patrol heading back to base." Victor waved at the fighters as they passed, and Elena saw one of the pilots wave back. It was a small gesture, but it felt good to be acknowledged by other military aviators, even briefly. The flight continued without incident for another hour. The landscape below changed gradually from the muddy farmland around their base to the more heavily damaged terrain near the front lines. Bomb craters and destroyed buildings became more common, and Elena could see the zigzag lines of trenches cutting across the countryside like scars. As they approached the field hospital where they were supposed to deliver their medical supplies, Elena noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Black smoke was rising from the airfield, and she could see vehicles racing around on the ground in obvious confusion. "Victor, get on the radio," Elena ordered. "Find out what's happening down there." Victor switched to the hospital's frequency and began calling. After several attempts, a harried voice responded. "Transport 7, this is Field Hospital 4. We are under attack by enemy ground forces. The airfield is not secure for landing. Recommend you abort and return to base immediately." Elena's mind raced as she processed this information. The hospital was full of wounded soldiers who desperately needed to be evacuated, but landing in the middle of an attack would be suicide. Yet turning around and flying back to base meant abandoning those soldiers to whatever fate awaited them. "Transport 7, did you copy?" The radio crackled again. "The situation here is deteriorating rapidly. You must not attempt to land." Elena made a decision that would change everything. Instead of turning around, she banked the aircraft to the right and began flying a wide circle around the hospital area. From this vantage point, she could see the battle developing below. Enemy tanks and infantry were attacking the hospital from the east, while friendly forces were trying to hold defensive positions around the buildings. The fighting was fierce, and Elena could see muzzle flashes and explosions even from several thousand feet above. "What are you doing?" Victor asked nervously. "We should head back to base like they said." Elena shook her head. "Look down there, Victor. Those soldiers need help. Maybe we can't land right now, but we might be able to do something else." As she completed another circle, Elena spotted something that made her pulse quicken. A formation of 6 aircraft was approaching from the north, flying low and fast toward the hospital. At first, she thought they might be friendly reinforcements, but as they got closer, she could see the distinctive shapes of German Messerschmitt fighters. The enemy aircraft were clearly preparing to strafe the hospital and the defensive positions around it. Elena realized that in a few minutes, those fighters would be killing wounded soldiers and medical personnel who had no way to defend themselves. Without hesitation, Elena pushed the nose of the C-47 down and began diving toward the approaching fighters. Victor grabbed his seat, his face pale with shock. "Elena, what are you doing? We're not armed. This is a transport plane." But Elena wasn't listening to his protests. Every instinct told her that what she was about to attempt was probably impossible, but she couldn't stand by and watch those fighters attack defenseless people on the ground. As the C-47 picked up speed in its dive, Elena's hands moved over the controls with practiced precision. All those hours of secret practice were about to be put to the ultimate test. She had studied the theory of aerial combat for months, but now she was about to discover whether a transport pilot could really fight like a warrior when the lives of others depended on it. The German fighters were so focused on their planned attack that they hadn't noticed the transport plane diving toward them from above. Elena realized she might have the element of surprise, but only for a few seconds. Once the enemy pilots spotted her, they would quickly realize that a lone C-47 posed no real threat to 6 modern fighters, or so they would think. Elena smiled grimly as she adjusted her angle of attack. The German pilots were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one you never see coming. The first German pilot spotted Elena's diving C-47 when she was still 800 meters away. She saw him bank sharply to the left, probably thinking he could easily avoid the lumbering transport plane. What he didn't expect was Elena's next move. Instead of continuing straight down, Elena pulled the transport into a steep climbing turn that brought her directly into the path of the lead Messerschmitt. The German pilot, caught completely off guard by this aggressive maneuver, had to dive sharply to avoid a collision. As he passed beneath her, Elena could see the shocked expression on his face through his cockpit canopy. Victor was pressed back in his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. "Elena, this is insane. We need to get out of here." But Elena was completely focused on the tactical situation developing around her. The 6 German fighters had been flying in 2 formations of 3 aircraft each. Her sudden appearance had broken up their planned strafing attack and forced them to scatter. Now they were trying to regroup, but Elena had no intention of giving them that opportunity. She rolled the C-47 to the right and dove toward the 2nd formation of German fighters. These pilots had seen what happened to their leader and were already turning to engage her. Elena could see the muzzle flashes as they opened fire, tracer bullets streaming past her cockpit windows. The transport plane shuddered as several bullets struck the fuselage, but Elena ignored the damage. She had learned from her study of combat tactics that the key to surviving a dogfight was to keep moving unpredictably. The German pilots expected her to fly like a transport plane, straight, level, and predictable. Instead, she was throwing their aircraft around the sky like a fighter. As the nearest Messerschmitt lined up for another attack run, Elena suddenly chopped the throttles and pulled back hard on the controls. The C-47 seemed to hang in the air for a moment, bleeding speed rapidly. The German fighter, traveling much faster, shot past her like a bullet. Elena immediately pushed the nose down and opened the throttles again. The transport plane accelerated quickly, and she found herself directly behind the Messerschmitt that had just overshot her position. The German pilot was trying to climb away, but Elena stayed right on his tail. Of course, the C-47 had no guns, but Elena had discovered something during her practice sessions that the German pilot didn't know. The transport plane's large, sturdy propellers could be deadly weapons if used correctly. Elena closed the distance between the 2 aircraft until she was only 50 meters behind the German fighter. Then she pushed the nose up slightly and increased power to the engines. The spinning propellers created a massive wash of turbulent air that struck the Messerschmitt like an invisible hammer. The German fighter suddenly pitched violently downward, its pilot fighting for control as the turbulence from Elena's propellers disrupted the airflow over his wings. Elena watched as the Messerschmitt went into an uncontrolled spin and crashed into a field below. The first enemy aircraft was down. Victor stared at her in amazement. "How did you know that would work?" Elena didn't have time to answer. The remaining 5 German fighters had regrouped and were coming at her from multiple directions. She realized that her surprise advantage was gone. Now the real test would begin. The lead German pilot came straight at her head-on, his guns blazing. Elena waited until the last possible second, then rolled the C-47 inverted and pulled down hard. The transport plane dove beneath the attacking fighter, and Elena could hear bullets hammering into the metal above her head. As she rolled upright again, Elena spotted another Messerschmitt diving on her from the right. This pilot was trying to time his attack to catch her while she was still recovering from her evasive maneuver. It was a good tactical decision, but Elena had anticipated it. Instead of leveling out as expected, she continued her roll to the left and pulled the nose up into a climbing spiral. The German fighter, committed to his diving attack, couldn't adjust quickly enough to follow her through the maneuver. He flashed past below her, and Elena immediately rolled out and dove after him. This time, she tried a different tactic. As she closed on the German fighter, she began flying an erratic weaving pattern that made it impossible for the pilot to predict where she would be in the next few seconds. The Messerschmitt's pilot kept looking back over his shoulder, trying to line up a shot, but Elena's unpredictable movements made it impossible. Finally, in frustration, the German pilot pulled up into a steep climb, trying to use his fighter's superior power-to-weight ratio to escape. But Elena had been expecting this move, too. She knew that the transport plane couldn't outclimb a fighter, but she didn't need to. As the Messerschmitt climbed away from her, Elena pulled up into a steep climb of her own. The German pilot, thinking he was safe, leveled off and turned to look for the other enemy aircraft. What he didn't see was Elena approaching from below at a steep angle. Elena timed her attack perfectly. Just as the German fighter leveled out, she pulled the C-47's nose up and caught the Messerschmitt with her propeller wash again. This time, the effect was even more dramatic. The German fighter flipped completely over and went into a flat spin that the pilot couldn't recover from. Elena watched as the second aircraft crashed into a forest. 2 down, 4 to go. The remaining German pilots were now taking her seriously. They spread out and began attacking from different directions, trying to overwhelm her defenses. Elena realized that she needed to change her tactics. Up to this point, she had been using the element of surprise and the German pilots' underestimation of her abilities. Now they knew she was dangerous, and they were treating her like a real threat. Elena spotted a bank of clouds about 2 kilometers to the north. If she could reach them, she might be able to use the limited visibility to her advantage. She turned toward the clouds, but the German fighters moved to cut her off. The next few minutes turned into a deadly game of 3-dimensional chess. Elena used every trick she had learned during her months of practice, throwing the transport plane through maneuvers that should have been impossible for such a large aircraft. She dove, climbed, rolled, and turned with an aggressiveness that kept the German pilots constantly off balance. During one particularly violent, evasive maneuver, Elena caught a glimpse of Victor's face. He was pale green and looked like he might be sick, but he was staying at his post and trying to help by calling out the positions of enemy aircraft. "2 coming from the left!" Victor shouted over the roar of the engines. "Another one climbing from below!" Elena rolled right and dove, narrowly avoiding the converging attacks. As she leveled out, she found herself head-to-head with another Messerschmitt. Both aircraft were flying straight at each other at high speed, and Elena realized that this was going to be a test of nerves. The German pilot opened fire first, sending a stream of bullets toward Elena's cockpit. She could see the tracer rounds coming straight at her, but she held her course steady. At the last second, she dropped the nose slightly and felt the bullets pass just over her head. As the 2 aircraft flashed past each other, Elena caught a glimpse of the German pilot's shocked face. He had expected her to turn away, but instead, she had held her course like a fighter pilot. The psychological effect of her aggressive flying was beginning to tell on the enemy pilots. Elena immediately turned to pursue the fighter that had just attacked her. The German pilot was in a climbing turn, probably trying to gain altitude for another attack. But Elena had noticed something about his flying that gave her an idea. This particular pilot seemed less experienced than the others. His maneuvers were textbook perfect, but they lacked the instinctive timing that came from combat experience. Elena decided to exploit this weakness. She began flying in a pattern that would look like a mistake to an experienced pilot, but that might fool someone who was flying by the book. Elena deliberately put herself in what appeared to be a vulnerable position, climbing slowly and apparently unaware of the German fighter's approach. The young German pilot took the bait. He rolled into what he probably thought was a perfect attack position and began his diving approach. Elena waited until he was committed to his attack, then suddenly rolled inverted and pulled down hard. The German fighter shot past her, and Elena found herself in the perfect position to use her propeller wash tactic again. She accelerated after the Messerschmitt and caught it with a blast of turbulent air that sent it tumbling out of control. The third enemy aircraft crashed into a hillside. 3 down, 3 to go. But Elena was beginning to feel the strain of the intense combat. The C-47 had taken several hits, and she could smell smoke coming from somewhere behind her. Victor was trying to assess the damage, but it was difficult to tell how serious the problems were while they were still in the middle of a dogfight. The remaining 3 German pilots had learned from watching their comrades' mistakes. They were being more careful now, trying to stay out of range of Elena's propeller wash while still maintaining pressure on her. Elena realized that her previous tactics weren't going to work anymore. She decided to try something completely different. Instead of continuing to evade and counterattack, Elena turned directly toward the nearest enemy fighter and began flying straight at it. The German pilot, expecting another evasive maneuver, was caught completely off guard. Elena flew directly at the Messerschmitt as if she intended to ram it. The German pilot held his course for a few seconds, then lost his nerve and turned away sharply. As he did, Elena caught him with a burst from her propellers that sent his aircraft spinning toward the ground. 4 down, 2 to go. The last 2 German pilots were now working together, trying to coordinate their attacks to catch Elena between them. These were clearly the most experienced pilots in the group, and Elena knew that defeating them would require everything she had learned about aerial combat. The first pilot came at her from the front while his wingman attacked from below and behind. Elena waited until both aircraft were committed to their attack, then pulled the C-47 into a maneuver that she had never attempted before, a vertical spiral climb that took her directly between the 2 attacking fighters. Both German pilots had to break off their attacks to avoid collision, and in doing so, they flew directly into each other's line of fire. Elena watched in amazement as the 2 Messerschmitts began shooting at each other, each pilot thinking he was firing at the transport plane. One of the German fighters took several hits from his wingman's guns and began trailing smoke. The pilot tried to recover, but his aircraft was too badly damaged. Elena watched as the 5th enemy fighter crashed into a farmhouse. 5 down, 1 to go. The last German pilot was now alone, and Elena could see that he was getting desperate. He began making increasingly aggressive attacks, but his flying was becoming erratic and dangerous. Elena realized that she might be able to use his desperation against him. She began leading the German fighter on a chase through the sky, staying just out of range of his guns while gradually leading him toward the cloud bank she had spotted earlier. The German pilot followed her, probably thinking that he could trap her in the limited visibility of the clouds. But Elena had a different plan. As they entered the cloud bank, she suddenly cut power to both engines and pulled up into a steep climb. The C-47 slowed rapidly and seemed to disappear in the gray mist. The German fighter, traveling much faster, shot past her position and continued climbing. Elena waited a few seconds, then pushed the nose down and accelerated after him. When they both emerged from the clouds, Elena was directly behind the Messerschmitt. The German pilot looked back and saw the transport plane bearing down on him. In panic, he pulled up into a vertical climb, trying to use his superior power to escape. But Elena had positioned herself perfectly. As the German fighter climbed almost vertically, Elena pulled the C-47's nose up and caught the Messerschmitt with the most powerful blast of propeller wash yet. The effect on the climbing fighter was catastrophic. The turbulent air flipped the aircraft over backward, and it fell toward the earth like a stone. 6 down. All of them. Elena leveled the C-47 and looked around the sky. For the first time in what felt like hours, there were no enemy aircraft in sight. The sky was suddenly eerily quiet, except for the steady drone of her own engines. Victor was staring at her with an expression of complete disbelief. "Elena," he said quietly, "what you just did, that was impossible. Transport pilots aren't supposed to be able to do things like that." Elena wiped sweat from her forehead and checked her instruments. The aircraft had taken more damage than she had initially realized, but all the essential systems were still functioning. They would be able to make it back to base. Below them, she could see that the battle at the field hospital was still ongoing, but the situation looked more hopeful now. Without air support, the German ground forces were finding it much more difficult to maintain their attack. Elena turned the aircraft toward home, her mind already beginning to process what had just happened. In the space of 20 minutes, she had single-handedly defeated an entire squadron of enemy fighters using nothing but a transport plane and her own flying skills. As they flew westward toward their base, Elena wondered how she was going to explain this to Major Volkov. She had a feeling that the squadron commander's attitude toward female pilots was about to change dramatically. The damaged C-47 limped across the countryside toward home base, trailing thin wisps of smoke from several bullet holes in the fuselage. Elena kept checking her instruments, but the engines were running smoothly despite the battle damage. The old transport plane had proven to be tougher than anyone had imagined. Victor had been unusually quiet during the flight back. He spent most of his time looking out the windows, scanning the sky for enemy aircraft that never appeared. Finally, as they approached their home airfield, he turned to Elena with a troubled expression. "Nobody is going to believe this," he said quietly. "A transport pilot shooting down 6 enemy fighters? They'll think we made it up." Elena had been thinking the same thing. What she had accomplished seemed impossible even to her, now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade. She had used tactics that no military manual had ever described, flying an aircraft in ways it was never designed to fly. The victory seemed almost like a dream. "We'll just tell them exactly what happened," Elena replied. "The truth is the truth, whether they believe it or not." As they entered the landing pattern, Elena could see that word of their mission had already reached the base. There were more people gathered around the flight line than usual, and she could see vehicles racing toward the runway. Either they were expecting a medical emergency, or news of the battle at the field hospital had already been radioed ahead. Elena touched down smoothly despite the aircraft's battle damage, and as they taxied toward the parking area, she could see Major Volkov standing with a group of other officers near the operations building. His expression was unreadable, but Elena noticed that he was holding a piece of paper that might have been a radio message. The engines wound down, and Elena completed her shutdown checklist while Victor gathered his flight gear. Through the cockpit windows, she could see mechanics already examining the bullet holes in the aircraft's skin. Some of the holes were larger than others, and Elena realized how close some of those bullets had come to hitting something vital. Major Volkov approached the aircraft as Elena climbed down from the cockpit. Behind him were several other officers she didn't recognize, including a colonel with intelligence insignia on his uniform. Elena snapped to attention and saluted, wondering if she was about to be court-martialed for abandoning her assigned mission. "Captain Petrov," Major Volkov said formally, "I've received some very interesting radio reports about your flight this morning. The field hospital commander says you engaged and destroyed 6 enemy fighters. Is this accurate?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. 6 Messerschmitt 109s were preparing to strafe the hospital. I engaged them to protect the wounded soldiers and medical personnel on the ground." The intelligence colonel stepped forward, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Captain, I need you to understand the significance of what you're claiming. Our intelligence indicates that those 6 aircraft represented nearly half of the enemy's available fighters in this sector. If your report is accurate, you have single-handedly eliminated a major tactical threat." Elena nodded. "I understand the significance, sir. Lieutenant Kozlov witnessed the entire engagement and can confirm the details." Victor stepped forward and saluted. "Sir, Captain Petrov's report is completely accurate. I observed her destroy 6 enemy aircraft using tactics I had never seen before. The enemy pilots appeared to be caught completely off guard by her aggressive flying." Major Volkov's expression was slowly changing from skepticism to amazement. "Captain Petrov, you were flying a transport aircraft. You had no weapons, no armor, no support. How is it possible that you defeated 6 modern fighters?" Elena had been thinking about this question during the flight back. "Sir, the enemy pilots made the same assumption that everyone else makes about transport pilots. They expected me to fly defensively, to try to escape, rather than engage. When I attacked them instead, they couldn't adapt their tactics quickly enough." The intelligence colonel was taking notes rapidly. "Captain, I want you to describe your engagement in detail. Every maneuver, every tactical decision. What you've accomplished may represent a completely new form of aerial warfare." For the next hour, Elena described the battle step by step, with Victor providing additional details and confirmation. The officers listened with increasing amazement as she explained how she had used the C-47's propeller wash as a weapon, how she had exploited the German pilots' expectations and psychological weaknesses, and how she had turned the transport plane's apparent disadvantages into tactical advantages. When she finished, the group of officers stood in silence for several moments. Finally, the intelligence colonel spoke. "Captain Petrov, what you've described represents one of the most innovative displays of aerial tactics in military history. You've proven that with the right pilot and the right tactical thinking, even a transport aircraft can be an effective weapon." Word of Elena's victory spread through the base like wildfire. By evening, every pilot, mechanic, and ground crew member had heard some version of the story. Elena found herself the center of attention wherever she went, with people asking for details about the engagement and wanting to hear her describe the various maneuvers she had used. The reaction from her fellow pilots was mixed. Some were genuinely impressed and wanted to learn from her experience. Others seemed skeptical, as if they couldn't quite accept that a woman had accomplished something they had never even attempted. Captain Patenko was notably absent from all the discussions, and Elena heard that he had requested a transfer to another squadron. 3 days after the battle, Elena was summoned to the base commander's office. Colonel Dmitry Volkov, the major's older brother and the senior officer on the base, was waiting for her along with several other high-ranking officials she didn't recognize. "Captain Petrov," the colonel began, "your actions 3 days ago have attracted attention at the highest levels of command. We've received orders to prepare a detailed tactical analysis of your engagement for distribution to other squadrons. Your innovative use of aerial tactics may revolutionize how we think about air combat." Elena was handed a folder containing new orders. As she read them, she realized that her life was about to change dramatically. "You're being promoted to major and assigned as the chief tactical instructor for the new experimental aerial warfare program," the colonel explained. "Your mission will be to develop and teach the unconventional combat techniques you used against those German fighters. We want to see if other pilots can learn to fight the way you do." Elena looked up from the papers, her mind reeling. "Sir, with respect, I'm not sure my techniques can be taught to other pilots. What I did was largely intuitive, based on my understanding of aircraft handling and enemy psychology." The colonel smiled. "That's exactly why we need you to teach it, Major Petrov. If those techniques can be systematized and passed on to other pilots, we could completely change the tactical balance in this war." Over the following weeks, Elena found herself working with test pilots and combat instructors to analyze and document her aerial tactics. They used training aircraft to recreate the maneuvers she had performed, studying the physics and psychology behind each technique. The results were remarkable. Other pilots could indeed learn to use propeller wash as a weapon, though it required precise timing and an intuitive feel for aircraft handling that not everyone possessed. The psychological tactics Elena had used, appearing vulnerable to draw enemy pilots into traps, flying aggressively when opponents expected defensive behavior, proved to be even more valuable than the physical techniques. Elena also began working with aircraft designers to modify transport planes for combat roles. They added armor plating around critical systems, installed defensive weapons, and improved the aircraft's maneuverability without sacrificing their cargo capacity. The new aircraft became known as combat transports, and they proved to be highly effective in the battlefield role Elena had pioneered. 6 months after her historic engagement, Elena received word that the field hospital she had defended had been successfully evacuated. The wounded soldiers she had protected that day had recovered and returned to their units. More importantly, the innovative surgical techniques being developed at that hospital had been saved and were now being used to save lives throughout the war zone. Elena was also told that her actions had directly influenced strategic planning at the highest levels. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces had become much more cautious about attacking what appeared to be defenseless transport aircraft, never knowing if they might encounter another pilot like Elena. The psychological impact of her victory had spread far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Stories of the transport pilot who had defeated 6 fighters had reached troops throughout the war zone, becoming a symbol of how determination and skill could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Elena continued flying missions throughout the war, but now she led squadrons of specially trained combat transport pilots who had learned her techniques. These pilots became known as Elena's Eagles, and their distinctive aggressive flying style became legendary among both friendly and enemy forces. After the war ended, Elena was invited to address military academies and aviation schools around the world. Her tactical innovations had become standard parts of pilot training curricula, and her story was studied as an example of how innovation and determination could triumph over conventional thinking. Elena always began her lectures the same way. The enemy's greatest weakness is often their assumptions about what you can and cannot do. If they underestimate you, that underestimation becomes a weapon you can use against them. Years later, when military historians analyzed the air war, they identified Elena's engagement as a turning point. Not because of the 6 aircraft she had destroyed, significant as that was, but because of how her victory had changed the way everyone thought about aerial combat. Elena had proven that in warfare, as in life, the most dangerous opponent is often the one nobody sees coming. Her legacy lived on in the thousands of pilots who learned her techniques, in the combat transport aircraft that continued to serve long after the war ended, and in the simple truth she had demonstrated that day over the field hospital. Courage and skill can overcome any technological advantage when applied with intelligence and determination. The woman they had dismissed as just a transport pilot had become one of the most innovative tactical thinkers in military aviation history. She had turned their underestimation into her greatest weapon, and in doing so, she had changed the course of the war itself. Elena Petrov had started that morning as a pilot whom nobody took seriously. She ended it as a legend whose story would inspire aviators for generations to come. Sometimes, the most extraordinary victories come from the most ordinary people who refuse to accept the limitations others place on them. The 6 enemy aircraft she had destroyed that day were just the beginning. The real victory was proving that with enough skill, determination, and tactical thinking, there were no limits to what could be accomplished in the sky. Elena had not just won a battle, she had redefined what was possible.